There's a lot of hopelessness going around these days, as defined by author Jess Karp. In his book, Those That Wake, the citizens of New York are still recovering from a disaster known as the Big Black. They keep their heads down, faces buried in their cell phones, finding whatever minor comforts they can just to get through the day. The story primarily follows Mal and Laura. One day, Mal's brother disappears, and Laura's parents just forget she exists. Nothing seems to connect these two, but they need to work together to find out what's going on and what's gripping the city with an icy sense of dread. Those That Wake is a young adult conspiracy thriller. It came out in 2011, but received middling reviews. The concept behind the story is interesting, and tackling the concept of hopelessness is a good move, especially for a teenaged audience. But the book was advertised as a debut novel, and it shows. There are problems aplenty. For starters, while I think the concept behind the book is good, it's handled very poorly. Facts sometimes aren't stated clearly, or when they are, they're later contradicted. You could go an entire section with very little idea of what an area or characters look like. It felt like the author was trying to set up a minimalist set piece, kind of like the early days of RWBY, where all the background characters were literally just silhouettes, only with even less definition in the backgrounds. It didn't feel stylistic though, and more like the author just didn't know how to set a scene. The book is also a mess in regards to theme and weight. While the world was clearly in a state of hopelessness, it was clumsily handled. Every now and then, one of the side characters, a pessimist named Mike, would just loudly complain about how bad the situation was. It was as grandiose as a barker walking in and screaming, "Everything sucks!" I swear, that sums up Mike's entire character. He has almost no other purpose in this book. Aside from him, though, we don't have much illustrating the world, just background characters who didn't want to look up from their phones. The main four characters served as beacons in the darkness, never quite giving up and struggling through their own hopelessness, but the problems they came across were sometimes outright stupid. At one point, they have a staring contest with an elevator button. No, I'm not making that up. It's treated like the button itself is daring them to press it, and I could only scoff at how melodramatic the whole thing was. That was actually a repeating issue since there was very little gravity or threat that their problems really possessed. For example, at one point, Mal and Laura are trapped on top of a mountain with a few others. We're eventually told that they're inside a tesseract, and that the world just keeps repeating itself. They travel from one mountaintop to another, only to find themselves back on the first mountaintop that they left. But when they want to leave, they just slip between a few trees, and I guess that was good enough to get them back to reality. They had a significant issue on hand that went on for 2 chapters, only to find a solution with little more than an upward glance and a shrug. Easy solutions for out-of-this-world problems make things boring. Throughout this book, there was only one time that I felt kind of worried about the characters, but that was because we got a fake-out death, which resolved itself within 20 pages. We don't have any reason to get invested in the threats, and I found very little reason to be invested in the characters. It doesn't help that our main characters are incredibly flat. Mal starts off blandly and never really gets away from feeling two-dimensional. He's a foster kid who gets into a lot of fights and wants to find his missing brother. And that's the extent of his character. Nothing really changes and he never stands out. Half the story relies on him, but he mostly stands around and waits for other characters to talk to him or do something. This changes a little near the end of the book, but by then it's too little too late. I thought Laura had a better start as a character. She opens her first chapter by oversleeping on the day of an important job interview, gets a bit of attitude from her interviewer, then when she calls her parents for support afterwards, they claim that they don't have a daughter. She had potential, but it fizzled out the longer the book went on, and by the halfway point, I just didn't care anymore. The dynamics of her story became less interesting the more the story went on, and the more complicated it tried to become, but the characters all got lost in an overly convoluted conflict. And the side characters? Like I said before, there's the aged teacher Mike, who spent 98% of the book complaining, and there's Remick, a pseudo-government agent who's been tracking the weird goings-on to find out what's happening. He's the exposition machine of the book, and tries to give shape and form to the otherwise intangible threat looming over our heroes. I did like Remick since he was the closest thing to an actual hero in the book, but even he was still very thinly written. No one in this book really comes out fully realized as a character, but Remick was at least willing to pick up a gun and fight back. The tension in the story was supposed to come from the mystery and conspiracy working behind the scenes. Scenes were set up with these inexplicable events, like doors appearing out of nowhere and operating like wormholes, or an entire classroom of students suddenly appearing out of nowhere and acting brainwashed, beating up 2 of the side characters. These events are given the barest explanation possible, if they're given one at all. It just became frustrating because the book would compound mystery on top of mystery, and they didn't play off each other. It doesn't work because there's too much to keep track of, and none of it ties together nicely in the end. It's fine to have multiple plot threads, and it's fine to leave one or two hanging to tie back in a sequel. But if they all just hang loose in the end and they don't tie into the story well, there will be very little reason to get invested. While I was reading, I got the distinct impression that this book was trying to be like A Wrinkle in Time. That book had some complex ideas like quantum physics tied in to build upon the universe and actually had some relevance in the plot. In this book, none of the mysteries tie into the plot effectively. While they do work towards the theme of hopelessness, they all strike hollow. The most hopeless thing about this book is the writing itself. And there was also the obligatory romance. After getting captured and thrown into the Tesseract together, Mal and Laura meet and slowly work towards some out-of-place romantic interest together. While I wouldn't mind a romantic subplot if it was written well, this one seemed entirely tacked on, like the author was just checking an item off a list. The entire subplot, as if it really had enough substance to be called a subplot, felt like it was there because, damn it, someone has to get shipped. Every now and then, Mal would think to himself about how he wanted to protect Laura or stay close to her. And apparently she thought the same way about him. I'm sorry, but aren't you guys more concerned about the interdimensional portals you keep finding, or how everyone who ever knew you has forgotten you, or how there are no more records that say you exist? Priorities, people! What's that? You don't think I've complained enough? Well, stay seated because now I'm getting into the spoilers. If you want to skip them, cut to this time to go straight to the rating. It's usually good when a book stirs your emotions enough to elicit a loud response, but when you get to the big reveal in the expository climax, your exact words probably shouldn't be, "Oh my god, are you fucking serious?" The biggest disappointment in this book is when we find out what's been causing people to be forgotten or to sweep them away entirely. You want to know what it is? Are you ready for this? Here's a hint. No, you're not, because it's stupid. Actually, take a moment to think about everything I've built up so far. Try to come up with an answer on your own, and then just be ready to be wrong because you're wrong. The thing that's been screwing people over for years by this point, and bending the laws of physics, was a meme. Yes, I'm dead serious. I'm gonna give you a second to recover from how stupid that was.
The phrase fucking dumb gets thrown around a lot, mostly by me, but that is fucking dumb.
Now, when I say meme, I don't mean it in the way you're thinking. They didn't open a door and discover Doge at a control board. Instead, this uses the older definition of meme that no one ever uses and most people on the internet don't know. Taking this from Google, a meme is an element of culture or system of behavior that may be considered to be passed from one individual to another by non-genetic means, especially imitation. And if that weren't bad enough, the whole thing gets revealed in an exposition dump that goes on for more than a chapter by some guy called the librarian who we don't even get to meet. The librarian is a weird shadow figure who stays in the back and communicates only through radio or TV waves because it's safer that way. The librarian explains that this meme-generated disaster is the result of a prolonged cultural evolution and that there's no way to escape from it. Everything just hangs over our heroes like a dark cloud, and apparently the world's survival hinges on two teenagers, a disgruntled middle school teacher, and a data analyst.
Well, we're boned!
And if that weren't bad enough, the meme culture is presented through an antagonist known simply as Man in Suit. He's described as not having a definite form, and his face kind of shifts around a bit, like he can't decide what he wants to look like. It's a trippy description, but for an out-of-this-world, super-powered, physics-bending antagonist, it kind of works. Until you realize that this means that the central antagonist of this book is literally the personification of cultural evolution via memes. And if you think that's disappointing, you won't believe how easily he's beaten in the end. I mean, he's not exactly killed, but Mike kinda goes nuts in his single contribution to the plot, barrels into him, and this is enough to defeat Man in Suit. The stakes were so very high, and the solution was so very easy. It's never a good sign when a book just hands victory over to the heroes. Also, I have no idea if Remick died in the end, since we're not sure if he survived the building before it exploded. This book is dumb. Overall, just no. Don't bother with this book. It's a sleep aid. Boring, trite, and otherwise a chore to get through. This book was boring and pretentious. I finished it purely out of spite so that I could complain about it in this review. The characters are flat, the plot is not engaging, the conflicts are handled too easily, the romance is just thrown out there just because, and it all built up to this vast, vapid void of meaninglessness. The only reason I didn't rank it as kindling is because it didn't make me angry. It was just a struggle to finish. Oh, and apparently a sequel came out in 2003 called What We Become, but don't expect a review on that anytime soon. So, have you read the book? What did you think? If not, do you want to read it now? Whatever your thoughts, comment below and stay tuned for more.